It's the week ending Saturday the 18th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Britain, Australia and the United States unveiling a new defence pact, Boris Johnson's much-awaited reshuffle promoting Liz Truss to Foreign Secretary, and teenage tennis star Emma Raducanu becoming the first British woman in 44 years to win a Grand Slam singles title. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll and Sorcha Bradley. And from a range of freelance projects, may I say, none more important than the daily podcast he does with me, The Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicholl. Julia, you are kicking us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
US prosecutors are out for blood.
A lot of people will say fake it till you make it.
Fake it till you make it doesn't work in healthcare because you're talking about people's health.
So many people wind up in jail for such little things. This is not a little thing. And it's also, not only did they fool the investors, they fooled the media, they fooled patients, they fooled doctors.
Former board members and investors at Theranos speaking to ABC News a couple of years ago. Now, Julia, this is an underreported story, unless, of course, you listen to a lot of podcasts, in which case this has been a number one hit. But just so we're all on the same page, remind us, what was Theranos, who is Elizabeth Holmes, and what her tech company did?
So Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford University when she was 19 years old to start a tech company which became known as Theranos. So she began the company in 2003, and her aim was to come up with a device that could test blood for a range of different diseases, more than 200, using an incredibly small amount of blood, so just a couple of drops, compared to kind of normally when you would have to use quite big needles and quite a lot of blood to run the same kinds of tests. So in 2014, Theranos was estimated to be worth $9 billion, and Holmes became the world's youngest female self-made billionaire. But there were skeptics and whistleblowers, and by 2015 the FDA began investigating Theranos, and it soon emerged that the technology couldn't do what Holmes had said it could. And as we heard in that clip, investors were fooled, patients were fooled, media was fooled. And finally, the long-anticipated trial of Holmes has begun in the US.
And that's what's happened this week.
Yeah, exactly. So the trial has been pushed back several times because of the pandemic, and then also Holmes was pregnant, so that pushed it back even further as well, but it's finally underway.
So she's on trial for 10 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She's pleaded not guilty. Why is this your story of the week, Julia? What's been a surprise so far?
I think what has been really interesting is that the defence has they're trying to paint a picture of Holmes as a victim, which probably isn't surprising, but there's a new kind of line of argument that's come out, which is that Holmes's attorneys are going to allege that Ramesh Balwani, known as Sunny Balwani, who was Holmes's boyfriend for a while, as well as the chief operating officer of Theranos, they're going to claim that Holmes was abused by Balwani, so that Holmes suffered more than a decade of emotional, mental and sexual abuse by Balwani, and basically that, yeah, she was the victim. She didn't know as much as the prosecutors are trying to claim about the kind of problems with the Theranos technology.
Which really is a curveball, isn't it, Arion? Because until this week, there's never been a hint of anything other than Holmes being the master of her own destiny in her story. And I've even seen kind of feminist think pieces trying to deal with that. Like, this could be the first time we have a woman entrepreneur who is being accused of fraud, and there doesn't seem to be a nasty male puppet master behind the scenes.
Yes, although it is interesting that even as her story began to unravel, there was this New Yorker profile that noted that even her own explanations of Theranos' technology were, as the New York Times said, comically vague. And they cited this one example of her saying that it worked like this. A chemistry is performed so that a chemical reaction occurs and generates a signal from the chemical reaction with a sample which is translated into a result, which is then reviewed by certified laboratory personnel. So even at this stage, I think the question of how much she knew about what her company was doing had always been a little bit unclear. And so that's what began ringing alarm bells, not just in investors' minds, but also in the minds of the people who worked for her and the media at large.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, Sorcha, isn't it? That most kind of rings your bell when you're reading this story. It doesn't matter how many times you hear it, as I alluded to earlier. It doesn't matter how many podcasts and documentaries and everything else there's been about this story. It's kind of astonishing that she managed to convince Rupert Murdoch was one of the backers. The Waltons, America's richest family, invested in her through apparently sheer chutzpah, like no actual medical underpinning to the technology she was shilling.
And I think that's why it's really interesting that her defence is trying to build up this picture of her as someone who was naive. I think they've said that she naively underestimated the challenges her business faced. But that is kind of not how she came across in the media. That was not really the cult of personality that built up around her. I mean, she was compared to Steve Jobs. She was going to be one of the first young female billionaires. I think it is interesting that she got so far on essentially the force of her personality and a conviction that she could convey when actually it was backed up by very, very little in reality.
I do wonder, Arion, whether the media have something to answer there. Obviously, it's not the media that is on trial for fraud, it's her. But journalists never really, I mean, they may have asked the questions, but they were fobbed off with answers on the basis of trust. Oh, yes, we have the technology, but we can't share it with you. And they just printed it as if, yeah, she is the next Steve Jobs. It's all real. It's all happening.
Well, I mean, you think about so many so-called unicorns of the startup Silicon Valley ilk that have a great idea and may not have totally resolved what that idea is or how it works, or they may not be completely in compliance with the laws. Even things like Airbnb and Uber have suffered massive sort of legal issues over the years that they've been operating because they kind of just do that thing that we heard at the clip at the top of this segment of faking it till you make it. And I think, you know, she really reminds me a lot of Charles Ponzi, him of the Ponzi scheme, who we did an episode of The Retrospectors about, not in her approach necessarily, but in the fact that she just dreamed up this cool idea. It is a cool idea. Take a small amount of blood, do a massive number of tests on it. She just didn't happen to have resolved the technology to be able to deliver on that promise. But that wasn't a stumbling point for masses of investors to get behind her and go, yeah, that's a cool idea, we'll invest with you. So it is a really interesting case of things that we've seen in the past, people coming up with an interesting concept, getting the backing and hoping that it will result in the technology along the way.
Do you think, Julia, Silicon Valley has been embarrassed by it? Or is it actually, as Arion was indicating, they're just kind of how they work? And if you have a few companies where it turns out it's completely paper thin, everything that everyone's investing in underneath it all, it's worth it because the gambles pay off because every 1 in 100 is an Airbnb or is an Uber.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think Holmes is obviously an incredibly high-profile example of the kind of fake it till you make it Silicon Valley culture. There have been many other fraud cases in recent years with people convicted on kind of similar charges as well, and also pleading not guilty. I think as well, one female founder has said, particularly working in kind of health and tech, that it's incredibly difficult now to earn the same kind of credibility from investors. Media are more skeptical, and comparisons are often drawn to Holmes, which I think particularly poses an interesting question for female founders in particular.
Why should it, Sorcha? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any parallel just because, if you're a woman trying to set up a company that you are trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes.
Yeah, no, I don't think it should. I think obviously Silicon Valley and the tech industry is a very male-dominated industry. I think only 20% of new tech startups are female-founded. And it is a sad indictment that women are being held under suspicion because of the actions of one woman. And obviously that's not how kind of business should function.
It's interesting, Julia. I'm trying to think about the kind of prominent women in Silicon Valley that are featured and celebrated by the media. They tend to be involved in startups. I'm generalizing here, obviously, but they tend to be involved in startups that are kind of female focused. I've created a dating app for women. I've created something that helps women through their pregnancy. Or they're very high-level female executives like Sheryl Sandberg who are brought in to bolster a man's idea.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I wonder almost if that's also why Holmes, I mean, speculating here, but she worked so hard to fashion herself in the footsteps of Steve Jobs. Lowering her voice, I think, is a really fascinating part of kind of this persona that she built up. So she supposedly lowered her voice to more of a baritone, and people have said, they heard after a few drinks actually she slipped into this slightly higher voice. But it's this whole building of credibility and really trying to move away from a particularly female focused idea. And Sadly, I don't think it's particularly surprising that female founders are still compared to her. I think that, comparisons are drawn constantly between women, particularly in the media, and particularly successful women. And I think, unfortunately, that's just something that potentially comes with the territory in this day and age.
And the smoke and mirrors thing, Arion, I mean, whether you're actually covering for something potentially fraudulent or not, does have legitimacy in Silicon Valley, doesn't it? Because your IP is your product, your engineering is your product. Google wouldn't be Google if they'd gone around telling everyone how they did their algorithm. So you can kind of hide behind that. You don't have to share the details of how it works. And I don't see how you really deal with that.
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's a shame in a way that gender has been so sort of swept up in what's being put on trial here, because actually I think it's much more fair to see this as a trial of Silicon Valley and its culture in and of itself, more than something about a woman who started a company and anything about the fact that she's a female. But I think it's really complicated to think of how you get out of this situation of trying to make sure that products that reach the market do what the founders of the company say they are going to do without exposing their IP to all of the copying that could come and all of the losses that could occur if that IP gets out. But I think that really, the question is, was this a case of someone over-believing and overselling her product, or was this actual genuine fraud? And I think that's what is going to be the jury's responsibility over the next few weeks.
I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it is a trial for Silicon Valley. I think perhaps you could argue that Elizabeth Holmes got caught up in this kind of macho culture where at no point can you back down, at no point can you admit, actually, maybe we're having some problems, maybe we need to go back, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing. And I mean, that would be a generous view of it. But yeah, clearly, if there is a culture problem in Silicon Valley, if these companies and startups with basically almost no working technology behind them and no way of making profit can get so much money, get so much funding, and it's only at the point where her machines were being tested on patients, that's how far it got, that it was taken to that extreme, and no one or when people were flagging that there were problems and that perhaps the technology wasn't ready, the machine just kept going and she kept going with it too.
Yes, and then you have the issue of actual patients with actual illnesses like cancer being allegedly misdiagnosed, Julia, and that's why this got so very serious. But ironically, you kind of think if the machine hadn't, the literal machine scanning the blood, hadn't quite been rolled out at the time that it was, she might just have actually been able to strike gold with this idea, because medical technology is progressing apace, isn't it? The NHS, I think at the moment, is beginning a blood test trial that screens for 50 types of cancer. There are going to be at-home finger prick blood tests that can diagnose all kinds of things.
Yeah, the NHS trial beginning this week as well feels particularly poignant. So 140,000 volunteers across England are going to begin trialling a test. I believe it's called the Gallery, which can test for 50 different types of cancers. And it seems to have about a 50% efficacy rate as well. And this test is already available in the US. But I think what's quite pertinent about it is that medical professionals are saying that this test, if it's deemed safe for use in the UK, isn't going to replace NHS screening programs.
Okay, Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that if you want to buy cheap imports, well, I'm sorry, but that ship has sailed.
Quite obviously, we often forget how important shipping actually is as a critical infrastructure, and that after the ever given incident is quite another reminder. We need to pay more attention to what goes on at sea, and ports are quite obviously crucial in all of that. I think there's an urgent need now to rethink of how COVID impacts the shipping industry, and then also ask the question, is that only a problem of the pandemic, or should we think broader and ask whether there are structural problems actually on how we think about the shipping industry, how we regulate it, and when and how ports can be shut like this?
Copenhagen University's Professor of International Relations, Christian Buger, speaking to Al Jazeera last month. Arion, he says we need to pay attention to what's happening out at sea. What's been happening out at sea for the last week, then?
Well, in fact, the thing that's been happening is that the Swedish furniture store Ikea has confirmed to the BBC that it's chartered its own ships and now presumably sent them out to sea to tackle this product shortage that Christian Berger was talking about there, that's being caused by this huge and growing shipping crisis around the world. And that crisis is leading to not only soaring prices on goods, but this massive port congestion, as well as product shortages that people may have seen back here in the UK and in other places around the world, and the very real threat of empty shelves in the months ahead, especially around Christmas. So Ikea has taken matters into its own hands to try to get out of this crisis. Walmart in the US has done the same thing, and you sort of suspect that they won't be the last companies to do something similar.
Okay, so give us the backstory then. How did this crisis begin?
It began really because COVID-19 just really didn't cause as much of a dip in demand as the world expected. And shipping firms at the start of the pandemic just really expected a massive collapse in trade and idled 11% of the global fleet. And in fact, trade held up and rates of trade in fact started to climb. And this was for a couple of reasons, but primarily it's because consumers who were being forced to limit their spending on things like holidays and eating out began buying massive amounts of domestic goods and entertainment products and home office equipment to try to make lockdowns more bearable. And over in the US, flush with stimulus cash, Americans in particular started to spend big. But at the same time, ports in the US and China in particular often had to do these shutdowns where outbreaks among staff caused them to have to close completely. Plus, then you also had the Ever Given, that huge ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, which caused a massive backup in its own right. So all of these things kind of conspired together to cause the situation that we've got today.
Yeah, but Sorcha, China aren't just going to let massive multinational corporations like Ikea and Walmart just have their own ships and then be done with it, are they? They're going to get on this, I imagine. This is surely a temporary issue.
Well, who knows? I think lots of companies and manufacturers are really rethinking whether they should rely on China so heavily, even though it's the manufacturing hub of the world. Relations with China and the West are already very low. So this shipping crisis could mark the beginning of reorganisation of globalisation.
Have you noticed this yourselves, anyone, by the way, in terms of goods that you've ordered at the moment? Is anyone waiting for anything or found that they can't order what they want?
I would say, yeah, IKEA actually has been really hopeless for quite a few months, but
right.
I don't know if anyone else has experienced that.
No, well, I've just bought a new iMac, and I tried to buy one from John Lewis, and John Lewis basically said they didn't know when the new stock was going to arrive, and I was like, this is too important a purchase to do that, so I went direct to Apple, and then Apple gave me a shipping date in 3 weeks' time, then they amended that to a week's time, then it arrived on my doorstep this morning out of the blue, and I thought, wow, if Apple, I mean, literally one of the world's biggest companies, can't tell me when something's going to arrive on my doorstep in Hertfordshire, I don't live in Timbuktu, there's obviously a supply chain issue going on.
Yeah, we've been doing some renovations, and honestly, building materials generally are really hard to come by. Everything from, timber to lights to bricks even, it really is a problem. But lots of people will have seen supply shortages in Britain in McDonald's. Do you remember not long ago they had to pull milkshakes?
Justifying your prediction for the end of the McFlurry. You did,
right.
To be fair, mention it on the show, and then a few weeks later it
happened.
was news.
Well, yeah, so they had to pull milkshakes, and Nando's had to close, I think it was 50 stores or something, because they had chicken shortages. So there are these massive amounts of shortages just unexpectedly. You may even see holes in supermarket shelves where there should be products. And yeah, that is a sort of thing that is happening that is due to, it's due to many things in the UK, but a big part of it is this massive shipping crisis.
Look at Arion with his common touch, Julia. There I am with my $2,000 computer. He says you can't get a chicken wing. He knows how this is going to affect people. But whatever you're buying, it's going to hit you in the pocket, isn't it? That's the point. We've already had inflation figures in the UK this week that jumped faster in August than during any month since the Bank of England gained independence to set interest rates. Apparently sending one 40-foot container from Asia to Europe cost 10 times more than the price of a year ago. So those things will be passed on to the consumers when we eventually get these goods.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to highlight. The optimist in me sees there's potentially an opportunity that's come out of this crisis in terms of highlighting the need to diversify what is inherently an unsustainable supply chains, giving globalization and, Amazon Prime, we can promise to deliver it in a day. This kind of thing, as consumers kind of get more comfortable and happy and want to pay for that convenience, surely this was slightly inevitable. So on one side, you then see, okay, so diversifying a supply chain, what might that look like? Potentially more local manufacturing and also more kind of flexibility within supply chains as well. But ultimately that is going to hit the consumer's pocket, especially if, manufacturing then shifts from those countries where workers aren't paid necessarily a living wage, workers' rights aren't necessarily regulated or monitored in the same way. All of that has a financial impact. And I think the line is really where a consumer is willing to pay for that versus convenience as well.
In the UK, obviously we're being caught up in these shipping crisis, but it will be compounded by the fact that we're also facing lorry driver shortages. We also have our own issues on the post-Brexit regulation rules on imports and exports. So kind of this Christmas and the next few weeks could really be a chickens coming home to roost moment where we really see the impact of COVID, we see the impact of Brexit, and we see the impact of shipping crisis all kind of converge together in a food shortage crisis that we haven't seen since, the 70s, really.
Yeah, which kind of leads me to think a sort of lockdown one style thought, Julia, which is, if people can't get the latest Barbie at Christmas, they'll have to knit each other toys, and that might be quite nice.
Yeah, I don't know. I think Sorcha's use of the words chickens coming home to roost is quite poignant given my liking for Nando's. One other point in terms of kind of climate and potential opportunity that has come out of this story is one academic at the University of Plymouth has said a solution might be investing more in kind of smaller and medium-sized vessels than these kind of giant shipping vessels like we've seen with the Ever Given, which got stuck in the Suez Canal this year, and the story obviously was shared across the world during lockdowns, which in terms of climate as well could be positive. So it might be a case that, things will take slightly longer, but it's just about changing the modes of transportation as well.
Yeah, because if it isn't smaller ships, then I suppose it's air freight, Arion?
Yeah, air freight. Apparently Ikea is also looking to bring products from China to Europe by train. I think the reality is that we're going to see all sorts of diversification away from shipping, as well as the kinds of things that Julia's talking about making smaller ships that can go into smaller ports so that we're not so dependent on these absolutely massive container ships. But I think the other really interesting component of it is something that both Sorcha and Julia mentioned, which is this move away from globalization to, it's been called nearshoring, bringing your factories to countries that are nearer the destination, or even bringing your factories back home. And I think that would be a massive shift if this is the moment that does it. And, we do try to talk on this show about things that have slightly slipped under the radar that are going to have these huge implications for the rest of our lives. And if that is what comes to pass here, quite aside from ending up with knitted toys for Christmas, I think the business of deglobalization is a massive shift if that's what we see happen.
But it might result, however ethically we might feel that it's a positive thing, or if you're in local business you might think it's a good thing, Sorcha, it might result in longer waiting times, higher prices. We might look back on this period we've just been through where we get everything when we want it as kind of the golden age of consumerism.
That is a massive possibility. I think perhaps we need to start adjusting our expectations as consumers, that we can't go to the shop, you want a pineapple, I don't know, maybe it's not there, or you want a brand new bike, maybe you can't get it. I think we might be returning to these kind of days of where you do have to wait for longer. you do have limited choice available, and you kind of have to make the best with what you got, which actually I think is a bit of a scary prospect, really.
I'm so suggestible. I do want a pineapple now. Sorcha, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Sorcha, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we try to bring ancient giants back to life?
Small number of genes can make amazing differences in both of these two species. Sergei Zimov has been telling us, at least since 2005, of the potential impending threat to the entire world that comes from the threat to the Arctic carbon. There's more carbon sequestered in the grasses and other things in the Arctic than all of the rainforest burnt to the ground, times 2.5. So this is mammoths are hypothetically a solution to this, but we need to explore whether this is the only solution or even adequate one. Getting rid of the dead grass, stomping down the trees and stomping down the insulating snow in the winter so the Arctic freeze can get into the permafrost. These are the sort of things that could be achieved uniquely by mammoths.
Harvard Medical School's professor of genetics, George Church, speaking at TEDx back in 2013. Sorcha, can you explain what he was going on about and why it is your story of the week now in 2021?
Yes, so this week, George Church and a team of scientists and entrepreneurs have announced that they have started a new company to genetically resurrect the woolly mammoth. So the company, Colossal, wants to reintroduce thousands of genetically engineered mammoths back into the Siberian tundra, which is roughly about 10,000 years after they went extinct. And they hope that by reintroducing mammoths, they can turn the tundra back into grasslands, which are great carbon sinks. So it could be one solution to turning back the clock on climate change.
That's such a smokescreen, isn't it? Like, they're obviously interested in genetically playing around because they are scientists who dig that kind of thing. I mean, do they really want to save the tundra? They want to bring back the woolly mammoth, don't they?
I mean, I think all scientists, there's an element of, you would hope, genetic scientists, there's an element of wonder and seeing what you can get away with. But I would say, to be fair to George Church, he has been talking about bringing back the woolly mammoth as a one potential solution to climate change for about a decade. So I think there's a reasonable assumption that he, believes that it could at least do some good, I hope, rather than just kind of mad scientist.
Well, we don't have Jeff Goldblum on hand, but Arion, you physically resemble him the most. What does a de-extinction program look like? And is it a reasonable exercise, or is it going to bring about the end of the theme park? I mean, tundra.
Well, in this case, it should be made clear that they're not actually talking about bringing back a mammoth per se, but a cold-resistant elephant that is quite furry and has been infused with mammoth DNA. So
well, that's less clickbaity, isn't it?
Well, that's probably why they're talking about it as if it is a mammoth. But yeah, but the plan is, as he says, to try to bring back this creature to assist with climate change. But I must say, Olly, I completely agree with you. It felt like a huge back justification for a thing that they wanted to do anyway, and sort of put me in mind of the introduction of sugarcane into Australia, where, because we wanted sugar, they brought over sugarcane, but it came with it this pest that was the cane beetle, and to control the cane beetle, then the European settlers brought in cane toads, and those themselves then bred out of control. Humans' attempts to try to introduce species into different types of ecosystems have notoriously gone awry. So that is one stumbling block of this. The other big question mark over it is the sort of scientists playing God thing that we hear anytime people talk about DNA meddling or cloning. This isn't a cloning project, but they're using DNA. But even so, I think there are legitimate questions that stem from that do need close inspection before we bring back these kinds of creatures.
And yet most of us, Julia, without really thinking about it, do eat these days genetically modified fruit and veg, genetically modified in moderate ways to help them survive colder winters or more chemicals, whatever the thing is. But nonetheless, not naturally found species. And, we may say we're ethically concerned about that, but like I said, we eat them anyway. Is it just in the case of this bringing back the woolly mammoth project that it seems so writ large that people are concerned?
Yeah, I think they are two quite different cases in terms of biotechnology. I think, genetically modified meat has really tangible benefits in terms of kind of climate impact, whereas I have to say the greenwashing alarm bells were ringing when I saw that, that's what the claim was with this project, because I think, so they're saying that there is a case in Russia where ecologists since 1996 have, I think it's called the Pleistocene Park, and they've reintroduced kind of bison, reindeers, camels to kind of run a similar experiment to see what the impact on climate change may be. And the theory is that these animals kind of stomp down the trees and things, and essentially these kind of compacted soils are then better at storing carbon and cooling environments. It has worked there. But then on the flip side of that, we're looking at a gestation period of, I think, 20 months potentially for this elephant mammoth hybrid. That, if you think about kind of then the carbon and the resources that are going into facilitating that, I don't think that it works as an argument. And I would be really interested to see what the carbon calculations of this experiment are going to be.
Well, also the money that's going into it, Sorcha, from people who claim to be conservationists. I mean, I had a look at this story on the New York Times website, and there were hundreds of comments. And clearly the most popular in the readers' picks were basically people saying, why are you wasting your economic resources conserving a species that went extinct thousands of years ago, when you could instead be saving elephants, like the humble Indian and African elephants in zoos that we see and think of as elephants, who are also endangered all over the world right now?
Yeah, I think, this company would argue that parts of the technology that they develop could also be used to save near extinct species. So, for example, the white rhino, which there's only 2 white rhinos left in the world, and they're both female. So it's kind of at the end of the line for them. And hopefully some of the technologies that they develop can be used to not just, as Arion rightly pointed out, this mammoth wouldn't be a real woolly mammoth. But in the case of animals that do still live, then we could genuinely stop them from extinction using some of the technologies that this company would develop. That's their argument anyway.
It's also not necessarily to the benefit of the animals concerned, I suppose, is the other concern, Sorcha. I mean, I'm thinking back to our story last week about dogs being bred for human purposes, aesthetically. Obviously people dig woolly mammoths, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the world does.
Yeah, there are obviously huge ethical considerations. For one, it's quite easy to see that animals would probably be exploited in the interest of bringing to life this kind of ersatz woolly mammoth. The embryo would have to be implanted into an Indian elephant, which would have to carry the embryo to term. That seems very morally questionable. Obviously, this woolly mammoth would have Indian elephant DNA, and elephants have very close familial groups and kind of mother-child relationships. Obviously, the plan would be to theoretically introduce thousands of these woolly mammoths, but at least initially that seems quite cruel. Another kind of big consideration is, could these woolly mammoths even survive in the Siberian tundra as it is today? Obviously, the ice age is over. Climate is very, very different there. Are we kind of, releasing it into the wild? It could be a complete failure, and it could, have no way of thriving and surviving. So massive ethical considerations that need to be taken to hand, I think.
The ice age is over. Truly breaking the news that is underreported this week. I mean, let's just get our crystal balls out finally on this. Julia, do you think, if you fast forward 10 years' time, that Colossal are going to meet their goals, that there'll be some form of woolly mammoth in Siberia? Or do you think this will just be, remember that press release from 2021 we all briefly looked at?
I would hope the second case. I think there's another point that's come out about the human populations that this is going to impact, and kind of an ethical side to that as well. If you see kind of indigenous populations who live in kind of Russia, Canada, United States that would potentially be impacted by the introduction of woolly mammoths aren't the people who are in this conversation. They're not the voices at the table. And I think kind of when the logistics of actually making this work come to the fore, there could be a lot more hurdles ahead.
Arion, are we going to see a mammoth?
I don't know about a mammoth, but something is going to be brought back. I say this because we have already brought back a Pyrenean ibex or a becado, which was brought back in the early noughties, though only for 7 minutes. The cloned fetus of this creature, which is kind of goat-like, did actually survive birth, but it only lived for a very short time before it died. So it wouldn't surprise me if something is brought back from extinction. I don't know if it is going to be a mammoth or at least an elephant-mammoth hybrid, but I think that we'll probably see this kind of science turn out to be a success, though big sort of scare quotes over what success means.
Sorcha, I mean, if I gave you, I don't know, $100 million, would you feel comfortable investing a percentage of that into Colossal?
You know what? I probably wouldn't. I don't think we're going to see woolly mammoths really in 6 years. But what I do think will happen is that there will be huge strides in kind of using gene technology and editing genes to save near extinct species. I think that's something that's kind of being looked at a lot. A lot of research is going into that. I think that's a more realistic outcome to these kind of grand projects, really.
Well, whatever happens, I'm looking forward to the woolly mammoth ride at Universal Studios. But that is it for this week. It is time to extinct ourselves. My thanks to Sorcha, Julia and Arion for rewilding us so brilliantly. Remember to follow this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.